Okay, good. Ready? Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you for joining us at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. My name is Mbongiseni Buthelezi. I'm the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. We would like to begin by just thanking you for bearing with us as we have tried to ask the weather gods to work with us. We understand that the traffic has been quite severe around here, so we have delayed the start of the program just to accommodate more people getting here. We understand some people are still stuck on the road, so people will be joining us as the afternoon unfolds. We, of course, are outside of the window that Madiba used to give people who were coming to see him. He was very punctual. And he only waited 10 minutes. If somebody was running late, the meeting would not happen, as people who worked with him in the room will attest. I see a few nodding heads. So with that, I'd like to kick us off. This evening, we gather to remember Rev Jesse Jackson Sr. We meet at a time when many around the world are confronting renewed challenges to human rights, to dignity, and to justice. As of this afternoon, 1,332 people are reported to have been killed so far in the new war that's raging in Iran. And more than 120 people have been killed in Lebanon in just the last week, since that war was launched by the United States and Israel. It is in such moments that the life and work of Reverend Jackson remind us of the enduring importance of solidarity, of courage, and of hope, which is a word he used quite a lot. We gather this evening to honor his life, his leadership, and his enduring call to keep hope alive. A little bit about Reverend Jackson. He was born in Greenville, South Carolina on the 8th of October, 1941. He lived under Jim Crow segregation laws, and that taught him to go. Those laws taught him to go to the back of the bus and to use separate water fountains, which practices he accepted until the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. He became active in local civil rights protests against segregated libraries, theaters, and restaurants as a student at North Carolina A&T University. After completing his undergrad degree, he attended theological seminary, but he did not complete his master's degree, and instead chose to focus on activism, on the civil rights movement. He was ordained a minister in 1968, by which point he was already working with Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and others since 1965 in the Southern Leadership Conference, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. He was selected to lead the SCLC's economic arm, Operation Basket, in Chicago, and became national director in 1967. In 1971, he and others launched Operation Save Humanity, which was later named Operation to Serve Humanity, conducting boycotts of businesses to induce them to provide more jobs and business to black people, as well as running programs for housing, for social services, and for voter registration to get more black voters registered. Among other things, just to end off on that part of the history, is that in 1984, he launched the Rainbow Coalition to run for president. And in 1988, he ran for the Democratic Party nomination for candidate for president. I will not say more about his more recent history because the speakers this evening will say more about that. And only to end off by saying, of course, as we all know, he died on the 17th of February, 2026 in Chicago at the age of 84. Reverend Jackson was a towering figure in the global struggle for civil rights and a steadfast supporter of South Africa's liberation movement. His relationship with Nelson Mandela reflected the deep connections between the struggle for civil rights in the United States and the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, as we will hear from our speakers today. In terms of how our program is going to run, we have 4 speakers in total. But after each of the 4 speakers have spoken, we'd like to invite people in the room who would like to share reflection, share a memory, or to send a word of condolence to the family to do so. So we will have a roving mic and we'll invite a few people to say a few words. To begin our program, we'd like to invite you to watch a short video of Reverend Jackson when he visited this foundation following the passing of Madiba in 2013. He was standing in this very room when he gave this speech, from which we'd like to show you an excerpt. Thank you.
Good evening. I want to talk a bit about this long journey from apartheid to freedom, an even longer journey from freedom to equality. I'm struggling tonight to fight for the narrative, the privileged life of Mr. Mandela and those with whom he worked. But there's an attempt in his death to do what they could not do in life, take away his story. The man expanded a movement of which he was a part and seized the moment. I was blessed to be here in 1979 on the deep dark days of apartheid, and back again in 1990 when Mr. Mandela was released from prison that Sunday, to meet him first as an American, and then to be here for the inauguration in 1994. And my first point, I do not want us to separate Mr. Mandela from the ANC or from the Mbekis and the Sisulus with whom he found companionship. He met us to the hall and said, "Jess, my boy, welcome, freedom fighter." And they asked about Randall Roberts and other American freedom fighters. The issue is not how much he changed in jail, but how much South Africa changed because he was jailed. When his body was freed, the world shook. When his spirit was released, the world shook again. There's a suggestion that he matured in jail and became a different man. Madiba didn't change his ideals. White supremacy lost its authority and changed their response from annihilation to coexistence. He did not go to jail as some out-of-control youth who needed to be matured. He went as a freedom fighter and came out as a freedom fighter. We defeated legal political infrastructure of racist apartheid. To speak of his being such a forgiving man, winners are empowered to forgive or redeem. To forgive, you must first deal with the issue of repentance and contrition. This system repented. One about to be governed had the choice to forgive or to reject. He was shaped by the fire, the oven of apartheid externally, and his internal will to resist and willingness to fight back became that combination. He used his mind and his body and spirit to transform the order, legal demonstrations, and the military. He fought to change the law. A leader, internal will to fight back. Leaders mold opinion, don't just follow opinion polls. Leaders sacrifice personal gratification for the higher, greater good. Leaders choose the laws of sacrifice, which leads to greatness, over the laws of convenience, which leads to collapse. We learn in the struggle. Literacy is the key to liberation. Strong minds break strong chains. He was an enlightened, literate man. Forgiveness, a key to reconciliation, requires repentance and contrition. White in jail. While in jail, he said, keep sanctions, end racist apartheid, free all political prisoners, end state of emergency, end passbooks, afford the right to vote, constitutional guarantees, legitimately elected democratic government on a non-racial basis. He helped change the world opinion against apartheid and made South African apartheid a pariah nation, inspired sanctions against state-sponsored terrorism. Apartheid. Whites had all U.S. and Britain privileges. They had the right to travel, educate, and trade and stock exchange. But in the end, South African apartheid, upon being defeated, repented with public contrition, saying skin level apartheid is wrong.
Poignantly, I rise to invite Dr. Naledi Pandor to reflect on Reverend Jackson tonight. For me, this is a moment of tying together threads of activism, service, and solidarity. In that, in 2013, when Reverend Jackson delivered that speech, Dr. Pandor spoke on the same podium as Reverend Jackson. At the time, she was Minister of Home Affairs in South Africa. Another speaker who spoke as well on that day is Ms. Eleanor Susudu, who I will refer to at the end for something that she said that I'm taking a leaf out of this evening. So, as I said then, Dr. Pandor was Minister of Home Affairs. Today, Dr. Pandor is the chair of the board of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Please join me in inviting Dr. Pandor to share her reflections.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buthelezi. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the foundation. I like that title, of the board of the foundation, because when you leave government, people keep speaking of you as former, as though you don't exist. And so I keep scratching out former and putting chairperson of Nelson Mandela Foundation. So thank you to you, CEO. Allow me to recognize all the distinguished guests that are present here, particularly Ambassador Masekela. And really, seriously, thank you to you for coming here. I also wish to recognize the Deputy Secretary General of the African National Congress, Ms. Nomvula Mokonyane. And of course, our CEO, Dr. Buthelezi, who you've been listening to, the trustees of the foundation, and ladies and gentlemen, I recognize each and every one of you, and I thank you most sincerely for being here. We felt that it would be totally wrong for South Africa not to mark the passing of Rev Jesse Jackson. And I must confess that it was in discussion with the Deputy Secretary General that she said, shouldn't the foundation do something? And I said, shouldn't the ANC do something? And in the end, we agreed that the foundation would do something. So thank you, DSJ. So I'm really pleased that you've been able to join us in marking the life of service and the indelible contribution to justice and equality of the recently departed civil rights leader, Rev Jesse Jackson. The Nelson Mandela Foundation is currently implementing a 3-year strategic program under the theme, Kholihlahla, Making Good Trouble. We recognize that the globe is confronted by deeply complex and dangerous circumstances which require men, women, and youth who will provide leadership by making good trouble, as Nelson Mandela once called for. Our founder, Mr. Nelson Mandela, strongly believed that human beings exist not merely to live, but to do things and to make a difference. This is why so much of what Mandela said and wrote called on us not to be passive and to be robust in advancing justice, equality, and freedom. He suggested in one of his talks that if you're not making a difference, you're really not living. We acknowledge that while Mr. Mandela utilized that call I've referred to, which is our strategic theme of making good trouble, and called on us to shake the tree of liberty, he joined a leader who had originally made that call for the need for people to make good trouble. That was Mr. John Lewis, who became a senator in the United States of America, a co-leader of the civil rights movement, who worked alongside Rev Jesse Jackson and Rev Martin Luther King. The civil rights movement in the United States of America played an important role in the international anti-apartheid solidarity movement. I don't know how many of you know what that is. If I asked you to stand up and give me 3 minutes on the international anti-apartheid solidarity movement, I don't know how many of you in this room can do that. But it is such an important part of our struggle against apartheid that I think all of us need to do something about learning about it, because we have forgotten that the denial of human rights should be a concern of all humanity, and that when we as South Africans said that to the world joined with us in fighting against apartheid. And certainly the civil rights movement in the United States was party to that. They joined our struggle through mounting protests that challenged and profiled legalized racial segregation and discrimination, and highlighted in particular the 2 countries in the world that had the worst manifestations of white supremacy oppression: South Africa and the United States of America. Reverend Jesse Jackson and his son, Congressman Jonathan Jackson, told me just 2 years ago of the story of being arrested during a protest outside the apartheid South African embassy in the early 80s in Washington. Congressman Jackson told me he was the youngest in the cells at that time. They, along with many Americans, recognized that crimes against humanity require global cooperation if they are to be effectively challenged. As has been said, Jesse Jackson was born in Greenville, Carolina. He was born to Helen Burns, an 18-year-old high school student, and Noah Louis Robinson, an adult neighbor of his mother's family. His mother married Charles Henry Jackson when Jesse was just 1 year old, and Mr. Jackson adopted Jesse, who assumed his surname. Jesse Jackson reported that he remained close to both men and spoke of himself as having two fathers. He cited his origins as giving him the impetus to succeed. He attended a racially segregated school in Greenville and achieved academic and sporting success despite experiencing racism. He decided to disobey racial laws through beginning his active participation at school level, but most particularly through activism in the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. The attitude he had toward the pursuit of justice was very important to him. I sought a meeting with him in 2023 to discuss a bill that was being piloted in the Congress of the United States and to ask for his help in lobbying against that piece of legislation. At that time, he was already in a wheelchair, but was very active in activities in support of the people of Palestine's quest for self-determination and sovereignty. And he granted me time with him and spoke very fondly of Mr. Mandela, who he loved a great deal, but most particularly of South Africa, which he regarded as a beacon of constitutional freedoms, and which he hoped would be the country that will show the world what respect for human dignity and basic human freedoms means. And so he regarded the action of South Africa of taking Israel to the International Court of Justice as an extremely appropriate action by a country committed to international solidarity, international law, and freedom of all peoples. I benefited greatly from that discussion. I think that as the global community, we have to begin to urgently consider how we may collectively prepare to repel the excesses that we're seeing today in the geopolitical sphere. And we need to move away from this apparent belief that reason might prevail. We are in an unreasonable season in world affairs, and we have to act. The world currently needs people who are unafraid of making good trouble and who are ready to create a world that is more just, more caring, and more responsive to upholding human dignity. Reverend Jackson reflected these qualities in his extraordinary life. He was a great civil rights leader, working side by side with Reverend Martin Luther King. He was also an ordained Baptist minister, So the fact that you're a priest doesn't mean you can't understand freedom. He was a Baptist minister who stood with the oppressed and was also a politician who was an activist for social justice. He gave practical effect to his social justice concerns by founding PUSH, People United to Serve Humanity, and the Rainbow Coalition, an organization that still advances community development and social justice up to today. In an extraordinary act for a civil rights leader in the unequal domain of America, he bravely ran 2 presidential primary candidate election campaigns in 1984 and 1988. His campaigns were remarkable in that for the first time, the lived experience of African Americans formed a visible part of a presidential campaign. Rev Jackson made the experience of discrimination, of poverty, and of exclusion visible to America. He spoke for women supporting single-parent-headed households and empathized directly with all who had experienced even one action of racism. While he confronted severely hostile campaigning and a negative backlash from wealthy, well-endowed white candidates, he put up a remarkable set of campaigns and was probably a positive example for President Barack Obama and other black candidates in America who have dared to challenge orthodoxy. Just like the first president of democratic South Africa, our Nelson Mandela, Reverend Jackson believed with freedom anything was possible, and that formerly oppressed people should never push themselves to the margins of society. They should lead and strive to achieve all their aspirations and live lives of hope that work to make a difference. In his famous 1984 campaign speech, he repeated the words, "I understand," more than a dozen times in referring to black lived experience, and then concluded his speech by calling on all his supporters and all the oppressed to always have hope and to never give up striving for better. That I understand rings in my head as I recall him. I understand what it means to be a poor teenage mother. I understand what it means not to have shoes for school. I understand what it means to never have had a job. But always have hope and never give up striving for better. Thank you very much to all of you for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Pandor, for reminding us that we are in an unreasonable season in which more and more of us need to make good trouble. Otherwise, we would not have lived. And thank you as well for disclosing my secrets. I had deliberately, in my introduction, not disclosed who the speakers are going to be. I will be disclosing them one by one as I invite them to come and speak. But Dr. Pandor was in government for so long that protocol is really important. And in doing so, she's now given away who I'm going to be inviting to speak. Allow me then to invite reflections from Ambassador Barbara Masekela next. It is an honor to invite former South African ambassador to the United States, who also was in an earlier life chief of staff to Nelson Mandela from 1990 to 1995, and played a really important role during South Africa's democratic transition. She, of course, is a stalwart of the anti-apartheid movement, an activist, a poet, a diplomat, who also served as South Africa's ambassador to France, to UNESCO, and of course to the United States. More recently, she's been the founder of the Johannesburg Festival of Women Writers, which is taking place this weekend. And of course, the author of a memoir, Poli Poli, which was published in 2022. Ambassador Masekela.
Good evening, everybody. I think I forgot my glasses. Someone said that there are glasses for people who are all over 50. They wear the same glasses, so you don't need special ones. It is fitting that we have gathered here at the Nelson Mandela Foundation to honor and celebrate the life of Rev Jesse Jackson, a great freedom fighter and a lover of his people in Africa and all over the world. It is something that Dr. Nelson Mandela would have done himself, because he had an abiding admiration and respect for this man, whom he considered his son and his leader. Jesse Jackson was admired for his ability to be at the right place at the right time. So it was not surprising that he was one of the first of our brethren from the United States of America to arrive in South Africa when the old man was released from jail. There are two compatriots of ours who should be here today, but they're not. Lindiwe Mabuza and Johnny Makatini. They worked very, very closely with Reverend Jesse Jackson. And I think that it would have been appropriate for them. I think that today is also a day for a little bit of history. Because as my sister Naledi Pandor has pointed out, there are things that we must speak about and which we must teach the generations that come after us. And that we have neglected that duty. And I'm glad that she has also pointed out the relationship between the struggles in America and in the diaspora, the African diaspora, and our own struggle, particularly in our country at this time. Because I must say that sometimes I blush at what some of my compatriots, how they refer to people from other countries. And as has been pointed out already, our liberation is something that we won with our own sacrifices and our own courage, but we did not do it alone. We were assisted by the whole world. And I think one of the things perhaps that I should say also is that we were very fortunate to have a leader like Oliver Tambo, because Oliver Tambo was the architect of our international solidarity campaigns. And he was able to marshal people from every walk of life in every country to support us. But not only did it benefit ourselves, but it benefited them as well, because in order for them to support us, they had to admit that, like us, they were human beings, and what was being done to us was being done to them directly. And this, more than anything today in this uncertain world, is something that we need to remember, and that we ought to remind ourselves that what is occurring in parts of the world and what is being done to people in Palestine, what is being done to people who are being oppressed in Iran, is being done to ourselves, and that it will be done to ourselves if we do not do something about it. I also thought that today is also a day in which we have to remember Jesse Jackson in the context of the fact that the solidarity between people in Southern Africa and in the rest of the world did not begin with the anti-apartheid struggle, but that it is something that we can trace back to even earlier generations. The generation of the Nkrumahs, of the W.E.B. Du Boises, of the many, many Africans who studied in the United States and had an opportunity to see how Black people were treated. It gave them an education, but at the same time, the African Americans were also able to get an education from us about colonialism, and they learned about colonialism. So what we see in Reverend Jesse Jackson is something that has always been a tradition in history. There have always been links between people of color who have suffered from colonialism and racism. So solidarity is something that is a legacy that we have inherited and which we must continue to strengthen and build, not only for ourselves, but for the generations to come, because our young people have not had the experience of apartheid. They do not even know about slavery, some of them. And in fact, as South Africans ourselves, we did not even know about slavery in our own country. I am one of the people who had, I don't know whether I want to call it an opportunity. Anyway, I studied in the United States. And I must say that one of the things that was key to my growth was the civil rights movement in the United States, because I could see it as something that I myself had suffered. But we were also lucky, my generation, because we were in the United States at a time of great activism you know, the Angela Davises, you know, the Jesse Jacksons, those were the heroes of the time. And we were able to keep our links with our own liberation movement because we had the example before us of the Jesse Jacksons. What is remarkable to me about Reverend Jesse Jackson is that I think in terms of caring about the inner life of black people, that he was unique. Because I think that generally speaking, we talk about hospitals, about schools, about those things you could touch and feel by providing them with the cultural exposure that touches more than the fact that they want to have Adidas shoes or you know, they want to have a dress like Beyonce's or you know, those material things, but something that we cannot touch. Something which is their imagination and something that arms them to look at the world not entirely in terms of their victimhood, but in terms of what they can become. Because that's what the imagination does, and that is what culture does. It shows you that those things that we speak about, the humanity, are not just abstract ideas, but that they are real, and that we are one with other human beings, and that we belong to the same world. Jesse Jackson came from, I would say, a place that we would parallel with places like Guguletu, Soweto. He knew about poor people and he cared about poor people and he understood poor people. And I think that, you know, there was always that kind of, what, if I was speaking of a South African, I would say there was that township boy in him. There was that person who was eager to say, I am somebody. I am somebody, which was one of his slogans that he utilized, because he realized that, and also, I mean, with the boycott movement, he started the boycott movement in the civil rights era. You know, it was not so much about constitutions and all, but it was about the very everyday life of people. And that he wanted to change the quality of the human being. I keep on repeating this because I really think it is so important in our country. And I think that Jackson, he was a teacher, and in being teachers in our nation. And that we need to learn from him, because he went back to the ghetto. He went back to the ghetto. I'm not going to criticize our own politicians, but I'm going to say that Jesse Jackson went back to Operation Breadbasket. It was about food. It was about people having a meal every day. It was about supporting black business where they were. And it was about rubbing shoulders with ordinary people. And he did that from the beginning to the end. But he was also a very shrewd politician, and I think that's why Tata Mandela liked him so much. Because Jesse Jackson, he is the one who went to Iraq to speak about the release of Americans and other people who had been detained for fighting against the Iraqis. And he went to ask for their release because he was first and foremost an American citizen. Because fighting for the rights of blacks in America did not mean that he was against America. He was against the laws of America. So, in order to gain support for his presidential campaign, he went into the heart of American politics to say, release these American citizens and these other citizens from other countries, to show Americans that he was a loyal citizen of his own country. He also went to Syria for the release. That was before his first campaign in 1983. He went to Syria and had an American Marine, I think, pilot, Navy pilot, released. And everybody was so skeptical about it. But he succeeded. And in succeeding in doing so, he laid a foundation for his presidential campaign. Very shrewd politician. And a very, very eloquent speaker. Of course, in the tradition of African American history and religion, a very, very effective speaker. So, for me, I think those are the important things about, he was a bridge between, the civil rights movement and the rights of everybody in America and abroad. And of course, it has already mentioned the trips that he took here, that the work that he has done in the anti-apartheid movement. And in his honor, and to pay tribute to him, I will conclude by saying that I think that, in my personal opinion, it is time that we resuscitated the links that we share with other people all over the world, especially at this time, when there is so much global uncertainty, when there is so much destruction going on. I think it is very important that we should work to resuscitate and rebuild the links that we have had with people all over the world who supported our struggle as their own, because we are going to need them and they need us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Masekela. Two things I take from your reflections. I think the first is that it is important for us to teach. I say this as a teacher, as somebody who used to teach at university. It was heartbreaking to see the ways in which certain disciplines were dying in the first 2 decades of democracy history, being one of them. As a lecturer at the University of Cape Town, I was in history briefly, and also in the Department of Literary Studies. one of the things that were heartbreaking, and I still continue to give guest lectures at the University of Cape Town. The last honors history class I gave a lecture to last year only had 3 students. So I think it is important to what Ambassador Masekela is saying, that we should teach. In teaching, the thing she's telling us we need to also be teaching about is solidarity. Solidarity because we need one another, but it's also solidarity because what has brought us to where we are is the solidarity of others, like Rev Jackson, which is why we're honoring him today. Ambassador Masekela also talked about glasses and people older than 50, all wearing the same glasses. I'm glad to say I'm less than 50. But I'm using that to say I'm also glad to see that there are people who are younger than me in the room, who are part of the solidarity networks, who are part of the learnings that we need to learn from our elders, those who've come before us. And long may this work of building the solidarity networks, of learning and of teaching continue. May we all, especially those who are younger than me in the room, continue doing that work. As I call up our next speaker, allow me to also apologize to the people on the live stream who are live streaming this event. I understand that the weather is not playing along, and therefore the signal keeps getting interrupted. I also do need to ask the next speakers, like Ambassador Masekela, to please stay as close to this microphone as possible for people on the live stream to be able to hear you. Thank you. Our next speaker is going to be Ms. Nomvula Mokonyane, who was the first Deputy Secretary General of the African National Congress. We heard Rev Jackson in the video say we must not take Nelson Mandela away from his political home, the African National Congress. We all must remember that Madiba was a member of the African National Congress right through to the end, until he took his last breath. And so I'd like to invite Ms. Mokonyane, who's a long-standing leader in the South African Democratic Movement and has held several senior government positions. She was the Premier of Gauteng, as we all remember, perhaps not those of you who are young in the room, from 2009 to 2014. She was also Minister of Water and Sanitation from 2014 to 2018, Minister of Communications in 2018, and Minister of Environmental Affairs from 2018 to 2019. Please allow me to welcome Ms. Mokonyane. Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Buthelezi, I just said to Dr. Pandor that, you see, you've gone back to the formers. Yeah, all the former this and former that. But thank you very much, Dr. Buthelezi. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And allow me to convey our sincere appreciation to the Nelson Mandela Foundation on behalf of the ANC, that the conversation with Sis Naledi has actually made this occasion to happen on a very appropriate day. On a very appropriate day, at the home or the place of the father of Rev Jesse Jackson. Couldn't have come in this particular fashion. The second issue, I want to also indicate that after the conversation with the chair of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, we had a session with the officials of the ANC, and President Cyril Ramaphosa spoke about, we all reflected on the passing on. And we are 7. The disciples were 12 amongst us when he told us that he's intending to go to the US. There were others who said, Ufunukyapa. And you'll guess who's that. And some of us who said, yeah, go, President. 2 of us said, can we go with you? And he indicated that, no, the 2 of you will create a problem. I'm going there, and he is in the United States of America. as a friend and a guest of the people of the United States of America. That is very important because I'm taking from what Ambassador Barbara Masekela has raised, what the chair of the foundation has alluded to, that our struggle is about humanity, it's a struggle for social justice, it's a struggle for equality. Our positions around international solidarity are intertwined with the solidarity of the people of the United States of America, and we are not anti-America. We are anti-injustice, we are anti-aggression, we are anti-violation of the rights of each and every individual and a nation that is entitled to its own sovereignty. So we're quite elated that today, Comrade President flew on a commercial flight to the United States of America, and he is the guest of the people of America in celebrating the life and times of Reverend Jesse Jackson. We gathered here today, amongst others, to reflect, and the elders, those who I come after, have actually said a lot. Yes, Sis Naledi and Sis Barbara. But what is of importance is that we're gathering here today at a time when the world, the globe, is being tested by those that Reverend Jesse Jackson belonged to, the United States of America. And on the basis of that, we want to celebrate the life of a fighter who never stayed silent when people were hating. A fighter who walked with Comrade Nelson Mandela, who drew fire from Reverend Martin Luther King, who carried the spirit of Oliver Tambo and Rosa Parks. He showed us that standing up for justice is not about where you are from, but rather about where your heart is. And right now, our hearts are heavy, especially those of us who stand for humanity, who abhor injustices and the dominance of one against the other. We have inherited the torch of those who embraced the vision of President Nelson Mandela, who looked up to the leaders such as President Oliver Tambo, and of importance, the torch that is now required, particularly at a time when the world feels like it is on fire again. Wars rage in too many places, and the human cost is heartbreaking. We observe and are deeply concerned on the Ukraine-Russia conflict that is dragging on, grinding down communities, destroying homes and forcing families to flee in their millions. The civilians bear the greatest brand. In the Middle East recently, the situation has exploded further. The recent US and apartheid Israeli strikes on Iran, following earlier escalations, have taken us into dangerous new territory. Leadership targeted, civilian areas hit, schools and hotels, clinics and hospitals. The risk of wider regional chaos growing by the hour. A few days ago, as it has happened in Palestine, 170 school kids were killed in the school premises before their lunch break, having left their homes looking forward to go back to mom and dad. And parents had to come and pick up dead bodies. And thereafter, within a period of 15 minutes, there was an attack again. Some of the parents died with their children in their arms. In Gaza and Palestine, even with the fragile ceasefire holding somewhat, suffering continues, people still displaced, aid blocked or delayed, lives upended. But what would Comrade Jesse Jackson have said? What would Madiba have urged? What would our internationalist Comrade President Tambo have said? And what would they have done in moments like these? They would have reminded us, firmly and without apology, that human rights belong to everybody, that they belong everywhere, that freedom is not selective, that liberty is not a privilege for the powerful. Of importance here in our country, this happens at a time where we're commemorating 50 years of the student uprising, where young people of Soweto and many other townships stood up against a tyranny that wanted to use language to further oppress and exploit the majority of our people. And in the spirit of international solidarity, many nations and young people stood with those young people of yesteryear, because the struggle of the people of Soweto, the students of Nyanga, the students of Mdantsane, was the struggle of the progressive people in the United States of America. We are duty-bound, therefore, all of us, to appreciate that our freedom, our political freedom, is intertwined with the freedom of many other young people, including the 170 young people, all of them below the age of 13, who were killed, and some died with their parents in Iran. International law is not optional. It's the line we draw to protect our shared humanity. When that line is crossed, whether by prolonged invasions, preemptive strikes, or blockades that starve communities such as in Cuba, we all suffer. These conflicts are not just distant headlines. War hits the global economy hard. Resources that could build schools and hospitals get poured into weapons. Millions still go to bed without a meal. Prices spike for food and fuel, hitting the poorest the hardest, right here in our townships and across the global south. And therefore, it is our responsibility to stand for humanity, to let our voices heard, and to be part of those that will be remembered, to have stood on the side of humanity. Mothers in Russia and Ukraine hiding in basements with their kids, families in Gaza rebuilding tents after floods, civilians in Iran caught in the crossfire of airstrikes, leaders get stolen from their own countries, leaders get killed in the company of their own peace-loving nations. These are the images that must haunt us, because they show the true price of those who refuse dialogue, of those who have no respect for humanity, of those who refuse to appreciate self-determination and sovereignty. And we should say, in honor and in memory of Reverend Jesse Jackson, what is it that we are going to do here in South Africa to ensure that what happens in any nation by those who are imposing their own aggressive methods of undermining democracy, that is determined by the material conditions of those nations, assume that they can be super cops, assume that they can be big parents to everyone, assume that they can be creators and the takers of innocent lives. We should make this call today, united in our diversity, from the bottom of our hearts, that as the world celebrates the life and times of Reverend Jesse Jackson, his spirit must live amongst us. We must make sure that we promote what Madiba stood for: peace through dialogue, peace through diplomacy, and peace now. However, of importance, we need to also call upon those who are in authority of overseeing justice and peace globally. The United Nations Security Council, where one of its permanent members opted to violate every piece of law that seeks to protect the rights of self-determination and humanity. And we need to say, it can't happen in our lifetime, because Reverend Jesse Jackson, Madiba, and Tambo have played their own part. We need to also play our own role. We should stand in solidarity with every oppressed and suffering people in Cuba, in Palestine, in Sudan, in Haiti, and in Venezuela, as well as in Iran, and across the world. Reverend Jesse Jackson taught us that one person's freedom is tied to everyone's. When one suffers injustice, we all feel the wound. But let's bring it home too, because our own story is not finished. We've paid dearly for our democracy and sovereignty. We must refuse to be bullied. We must refuse to be harassed. We must refuse to make a choice between those who stood with us and those who continued to persecute nations that were together with us. No South African who enjoys today's freedom cannot take a stance that President Mandela took in support of the people of Palestine, and today in solidarity with humanity globally and the people of Cuba. We have to work together to defend our hard-won freedom, our sovereignty. We have together appreciate that we may be miles away, but humanity brings us closer to each other. The men who are here to celebrate knew no boundaries, traveled and crisscrossed the world because he understood, because he had hope, but most importantly, because he understood that no injustice has to be tolerated irrespective of how powerful you are. He did it inside the United States of America, and as I conclude, we must also appreciate those Americans who have stood boldly against the bullying, against the undermining of the institutions of democracy in the United States of America, and call upon them to do the right thing in honor and in memory of Reverend Jesse Jackson. On behalf of the ANC, we want to thank you once more, the Nelson Mandela Foundation, for bringing all of us together here and those that are on other platforms. Let it not die, let it not be forgotten, but of importance, let it be the energy that is instilled upon us. We are not anti-Americans. We stand for humanity and social justice. We are against imperialist aggression and dominance of an authority that has not been democratically elected by any nation, that they are now undermining their sovereignty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mokonyane. The Deputy Secretary General reminds us that we're not anti-America. We are anti-injustice. We are anti-oppression. The one word that I want to just reflect on for a moment is a word that, of course, we've heard about how Reverend Jackson used it, hope. It's a word that he and Madiba shared. In Madiba's writings from prison, that is one of the words that appears again and again. And what hope meant, I think, for both Madiba and for Reverend Jackson, is not that you sit in your corner and wish that things were different. Hope meant you keep striving for the better world that you want to see. Reverend Jackson said, keep hope alive. Keep hope alive means keep working for the better world that we want to see. Keep being in solidarity with others and working together with others for that better world. And that is the challenge to us today as we remember the life of Reverend Jesse Jackson. It is my honor to now invite an American among us, having been reminded that Reverend Jackson was, after all, an American citizen first. I'd like to invite another one of our trustees, Ms. Alice Brown. Ms. Brown is a trustee of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. She's an attorney who, early in her career, I think very appropriately for us today, was a litigator and an advocate at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. She worked for the Legal Defense and Educational Fund. She's served in leadership roles, among others, at the Ford Foundation, and has worked extensively with various social justice organizations in South Africa over the last 30 years. Alice, thank you.
Good evening, and I would like to use that very overused South African expression. Please, all protocol observed. I'm really pleased to be here this evening, and I'm pleased to be a part of this program to honor the life and legacy of Reverend Jesse Louis Jackson. I should say that some of my fellow speakers have stolen some of my homework. So if you hear a few repetitive statements, that's good because you are going to be tested afterwards. So please listen up. No. Reverend Jackson led a full and impactful life. He was a trailblazer, an activist, a disruptor, an agitator. Yes, a troublemaker. He was a leader, and a leader not without flaws. During the 6 decades of his activism, there were some stumbles and a few missteps. There were some personal shortcomings, and he confronted a few crises and controversies. Yet, over the past 50 years, he was one of the most influential political figures in the United States, and his role in the civil rights struggle, his impact on US politics, indeed, his influence on the global scene, none of this can be diminished, disputed, or dismissed. According to various biographies, Reverend Jackson's leadership qualities were apparent from a young age. As a high school student in the early 1950s, Jim Crow, South Carolina, he excelled academically and on the sports field. earning colors in basketball, baseball, and U.S. football. In fact, he earned a football scholarship to the University of Illinois and spent a brief time there before returning to the South to attend North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, a historically Black institution of higher education. It was there that he became involved in local sit-ins and boycotts, protesting against segregated public facilities such as libraries, movie theaters, and restaurants. He joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, and actively engaged in its efforts to fight for voting rights for African Americans. It was during this period that the young Jesse Jackson met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and ended up becoming one of his protégés in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. In fact, Jackson was one of Dr. King's youngest lieutenants. In 1966, Dr. King appointed Jackson to head Operation Breadbasket in Chicago, which was the arm of the SCLC focused on improving the economic circumstance of African Americans. And it was 2 years later, in 1968, when Reverend Jackson would be among the cadre of lieutenants who witnessed the assassination of Dr. King in Memphis, Tennessee. After the death of Dr. King, Reverend Jackson separated from the SCLC and went on to establish PUSH, which stood for People United to Serve Humanity. Later, PUSH would merge with Reverend Jackson's National Rainbow Coalition, with the mission to push for a greater share of political and economic power for African Americans and the poor. Increasingly, Reverend Jackson spoke of U.S. problems as being rooted not only in racism, but also in class inequality. And speaking about speaking, Reverend Jackson was a powerful orator who was baptized not only in the liberation theology of the Black church, but also in the righteousness of the African American struggle for civil, political, and economic rights. I believe that it would be fair to say that Reverend Jackson was a spoken word poet before spoken word poets were, as the young folks would say, a thing. Coming out of the Black Baptist Church tradition, he had a gift for turning a phrase, delivering a message, and galvanizing an audience. And galvanizing is exactly what Reverend Jackson did during his presidential campaigns in the 1980s. It was actually Congressperson Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American woman elected to the U.S. Congress, who in 1972 became the first African-American and woman to seek the nomination for the U.S. presidency from one of the two major political parties. But it was Reverend Jackson's bold entry into the Democratic Party's presidential campaigns in 1984 and again in 1988 that were the first viable attempts by an African American to ascend to that position. Reverend Jackson's platforms during his bid for the presidency pushed the boundaries of the mainstream policies of the Democratic Party. Specifically, his platform centered on jobs, peace, and justice, and called for increased taxes on corporations and the wealthy, strengthening the Voting Rights Act and other civil rights laws, and reducing the military budget and reallocating those funds to education, housing, infrastructure, and other social investments. Beyond these issues, Reverend Jackson's progressive platform called for a universal healthcare system, support for LGBT plus rights, and note, this was at a time when very few politicians publicly supported lesbian and gay rights. Increased funding for research and treatment of HIV/AIDS, and in addition, sanctions against apartheid South Africa, and support for Palestinian statehood. Here, it should also be noted that he was one of the first major presidential candidates to call for self-determination for the Palestinians. It has been reported that the Democratic Party officials were taken by surprise by Reverend Jackson's strength in the primaries. He placed third in 1984, which at the time was the strongest showing ever by an African American. And in 1988, Reverend Jackson won more than 7 million votes, becoming the first African American candidate to win major primaries. He inspired millions to register to vote, and his campaigns became political and cultural phenomena. As we know, Reverend Jackson ultimately lost both nominations, but his progressive policies were instrumental in helping to transform American politics and in fostering the social democratic wing of the Democratic Party. In his comments on the passing of Reverend Jackson, former President Barack Obama called the Reverend a true giant and credited Jackson for paving the way for his own presidency. "We stood on his shoulders," Obama stated, and he went on to assert that Reverend Jackson's historical runs in 1984 and 1988 laid the essential groundwork for his own campaign. So that's some background on Reverend Jackson's impact on the domestic front within the US. But that is not the only part of his legacy, as we all know. Indeed, Reverend Jackson was not only an American civil rights activist and leader, he was also a human rights advocate. He was not only a civil rights activist and human rights advocate, he was also a Pan-Africanist who promoted the agency and autonomy of African nations. Moreover, he was not only a Pan-Africanist, but he was also an internationalist who advocated for justice and freedom around the world. In that context, Jackson's first trip to South Africa was in July 1979, where he witnessed firsthand the oppression and violations suffered by the majority of South Africans. Throughout the 1980s, Reverend Jackson advocated for sanctions against the apartheid regime, including advocating for the release of Nelson Mandela. He was a major figure in organizing and mobilizing campaigns aimed at pressuring the US Congress to overturn Reagan's presidential veto and pass the bill that became the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986. In 2013, looking back on his anti-apartheid activism, Reverend Jackson reflected, and I quote, "As a young civil rights activist, I knew how raw and ugly and violent the apartheid regime was. They were being jailed, we were being jailed. We were being killed, and they were being massacred." Reverend Jackson was appointed Special Envoy to Africa by President Bill Clinton and served in that position from 1997 to 2000. As Special Envoy, Reverend Jackson campaigned for Africa's economic development and promoted the continent's interest in Washington. He also helped to facilitate peace talks in countries experiencing armed conflict, including Liberia, the DRC, and Sierra Leone. Another example of Reverend Jackson's activism outside of the boundaries of the US was with his efforts as a hostage negotiator, which Ambassador Masekela has referred to. From 1984 to 2000, Reverend Jackson successfully conducted numerous hostage and political prisoner negotiations that resulted in the release of over 100 people held in captivity in various locations around the globe. Using citizen diplomacy, Reverend Jackson helped secure the release of hostages, political prisoners, and foreign nationals in Syria, Cuba, Iraq, Serbia, and Liberia. Even though some of his citizen diplomacy was criticized by the US government, Reverend Jackson's interventions were considered major diplomatic and humanitarian successes, and he became the go-to negotiator under Republican Presidents Reagan and Bush and Democratic President Clinton. Reverend Jackson explained to one of his biographers that he learned to become a good negotiator because while growing up in the Jim Crow South as a poor Black man, every day was a negotiation, and his life was at stake. He had a life that was formed by pain very early on, and he identified with the pain of others and those who were despised and demeaned, and he sought to speak for them. In coming to a close, I want to share a quote from Martin Luther King III and his wife, Andrea King. In summing up the legacy of Reverend Jackson, they stated, "He walked with courage when the road was uncertain, spoke with conviction when the truth was inconvenient, and stood with the poor, the marginalized, and the forgotten when it was not popular to do so." May more of us have the strength to act similarly in the face of injustice, especially during this dark period of, amongst other abuses and violations, backlashes against hard-won rights, the expansion and spread of authoritarianism and anti-democratic movements, a blatant and violent return to the politics of might makes right, and rampant disrespect and disregard for the rule of law and respect for human rights. Importantly, in the face of all this, we cannot despair and we cannot quit. Rather, we must continue the struggle, and in the words of Reverend Jesse Louis Jackson, keep hope alive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brown. You remind us that we stand on the shoulders of a giant. I'm particularly struck by the term citizen diplomacy. I think we have a lot to learn from Reverend Jackson about how to do citizen diplomacy. I'd also like to just mention that as we are gathered here today, right now, the People's Celebration honoring Reverend Jackson has started in Chicago. And now I'd also like to open up for reflections from the floor, if anybody would like to say a few words. Thank you. We'll start with you, sir.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Let me just stand up from my side so that everybody can see me. Right. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. My name is Khabusi Nyati, and I'm a master's student at the Northwest University, and I'm 23 years old. We have to take this opportunity to consider the fact that it's raining. And when it's raining, then it means that the heavens have opened indeed for Jesse Jackson. The achievements that he has made within this world are really immense. And the ancestors have welcomed him. So mine is just to profusely say that the works that I do at the Northwest University as a master's student echoes the work of Jesse Jackson. And let me just give you a practical example of what I do, like what my studies are all about. So in the country, we have a situation when it comes to youth apathy. Young people do not engage in politics. They do not engage in forms of shaping the world towards a better place. So they would go to parties and they would go and groove. But, and I'm not trying to challenge them because it's a place and an era of us having fun. But when there are situations that are confronting the world, they are not there. So my study is to investigate youth apathy, particularly in Potchefstroom. And I use the participatory approach whereby I look at empowerment, cultural diversity, participation, as well as dialogue. Because it's very sentimental for us as young people to engage in dialogue. And if we don't engage in dialogue, then it means that we won't be able to have policies that will represent our aspirations, and then tomorrow we'll complain and say the government doesn't do this and that for us. So I feel like it's time for us as young people, and I want to take this opportunity to say that I'm the younger version of Jesse Jackson. I'm the younger version of Jesse Jackson, and I'm not shaken by anything. In the way Jesse Jackson took to the streets and said that we need to reshape the world, I am an example of that, and I'm not going to shake around at that kind of a situation because I'm only 23. And just to challenge what you were saying earlier on, Mr. CEO, you said that Comrade Nomvula Mokonyane was the premier of Gauteng from 2009 until 2012. Well, I was 7 years old in 2009, so I do know, I do know that she was the premier by then. So, again, my condolences to the Jesse Jackson family. And one thing that I can say to young people is that let's be the Jesse Jacksons of tomorrow. We still have time as young people. We still have that opportunity to make a change. And another thing that I want to say, let us not be scared. Let us not be scared of what other people say. There are other external forces that are trying to infiltrate, that are trying to steal what we created, what the older generations have laid a foundation for us, because apartheid is gone. But now we have our own challenges that we are facing as young people, and what are we doing about it? So let us be the Jesse Jacksons of tomorrow. Let us be the Nelson Mandelas of tomorrow. Let us be the Oliver Tambos of tomorrow. And let us really take it to the streets and make example of what we are capable for. Thank you very much.
I see two other young people raising their hands. If you could just please pass the mic down. We'll take another 3 or 4 inputs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Protocols observed. Again, I think it's the culture of Ubuntu in South Africa. First and foremost, my name is Wepero Letlape, and I am so delighted and honored to be here. As I walked through here, actually, I was very greatly inspired, and we had like a minor conversation here with Mr. Mbule, who actually came through with me here, and I was listening to him, and it's like, By the way, I do remember that when I actually met Mr. Mbuli, it was when we had a culmination of what we call Africa Youth International Forum, to which I oversee as a chairperson. It was the first ever annual event that we had in South Africa in collaboration with the Wits Business School of Governance, whereby we actually was able to be privileged to host our dignitary, that is our mother, another one here that we do have the privilege to be with, in this, grace. It was, of course, Dr. Nkosazana Zuma Dlamini. So we had gathered a number of about more than 500 youth across Africa, looking to cultivate an atmosphere whereby that it is really indeed the time for the youth to come together. It is indeed for the youth to say that, we have looked for the questions everywhere else, but then it is the beginning of the new era of which today our youth must also stand up and take the stage, not only takes the stage, but also be able to stand on the giants that have actually paved the way. And by the giant, I'm talking about our late Mr. Rev here. Another point that I have noted was, that I felt very deeply moved, and I'm a young woman myself. I did not introduce myself because I think the pledge that I have made into my existence when I was with God in my secret place is that I want to live a life that is bigger than titles and paychecks. And that is the spirit of servanthood. So that is normally what happens in that kind of regard. I have served as the Black Management Forum, the National Deputy Chair of Policy and Research Committee, and also currently, as I've stated, that I'm with the Africa Youth International Forum. The bodies of the likes, when we talk about Black Management Forum, inclusive to the co-founders like Mr. Eric Mafuna, those are the type of leaders that actually work closely with Mr. Oliver Tambo. So for me as a young woman today, and to also be in this room, I feel that it is not necessarily about coincidence, but it's about alignment. And I say that, it is with the deepest honor, because for me it says that, it's a legacy of the possibilities that await. Our Rev here is the one that has actually made the way for us. And then again, coming into my brother, back to him right there, it is such a great honor to have another youngsters with similar mindset. It's about a visionary leader. It's about embodying the traits, of becoming the leaders that are not going to be standing on platforms or not being able to deliver, but having to say that, implementation and execution are actually the legacy that we should be, putting before us, before anything else, before the titles, before the positions, before anything else. It first starts with you having to have the spirit of servanthood. So I can go all day, talking, but that is because of the great conviction that is within me. And, I do believe that the likes of Nelson Mandela, Umama, Nkosazana Zuma, by the way, and Dr. Naledi Pandor, I was actually with her on the webinar that we've just recently hosted, as the leading woman of Africa. One thing that she said, and that has greatly moved me, was that as a leader, you must not only appeal to be the kind of a person who's always to be right before people, but you must also humble yourself enough to understand that you are the servant before anything else, and then you must always be at the submission of those that actually, you are serving. So, Dr. Naledi Pandor, thank you so much. Thank you for all that you've done and for proving to men like myself that it's possible.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So can I ask you to please just stand up and look that way, and we will take the last hand
And,
over there after you.
I'm
There's
shy.
a camera for the live stream, if we could just look that way. Thank you.
That one.
Yes.
I'm very shy, but I'll be very brief. Thank you so much, Doc. And to quickly reflect on what you have said and what Dr. Naledi Pandor briefly alluded to as well. You both mentioned the Montgomery bus boycott. And something always stands out for me when I think about, well, I've read about it because you can see my classes are for 30-something-year-olds. But Dr. King, when he was at, I think it was his first public address, I could be wrong, but he says something very important. And he says, if we are wrong, then the Constitution of the United States of America is wrong. And then he goes to say, if we are wrong, then God the Almighty is wrong. And that is the conviction with which that generation fought for the liberation of everyone, of all of us. And I want to say that we don't have a shortage of that same conviction. If you look at South Africa's liberation history, from the days of the foundation of the SANC in 1912 and not in Bloemfontein, we have never had that shortage. Even when the liberation movements were banned in the 60s, and we had Abobo Tatu Bishop, he's here, is filming me, Bishop Malosi Mpumlwana. His generation stood up in the 60s with the Black Consciousness movement that was inspired by your Du Bois, by the the civil rights movement in the US. So I want to say that the world is a better place because Reverend Jackson came this way, and they spoke and they walked the walk and they lived with so much conviction. And because young people have been saying, let's do this and that, I agree. But we must also not be afraid, and we must also not be apologetic about where we are in South Africa. In conclusion, because I said I don't want to talk much, I do want to say that I'm inspired by all the speakers, including yourself, DSG, and Mama Masekela. You mentioned something important when you said leaders must always go back to the people. And I've just completed my second book. It's called Democracy Through Tinted Windows. It's talking about the very same thing, and I'm going to make sure that I sign a copy for our DSG and drop it at Lutuli House. Lastly, I wrote something here that says, Reverend Jackson belonged to a generation of leaders who understood that the struggle for justice anywhere was connected to the struggle for justice everywhere. His voice carried across continents, and including in solidarity with those who fought against apartheid in South Africa. And so, by so saying, I want to say that these were the leaders who believed that moral courage could bend history towards dignity, equality, and freedom. That is why we must not be afraid to say that what is happening now with this war, it is wrong. And we must stand with the people of Iran and say that we are in solidarity with them. And two realities can exist at the same time. We can call out the human rights injustices inside Iran and still call out what is being done by the US and Israel to Iran. So the two are not, cannot be separated. By so saying, I want to say, may the spirit of Reverend Jackson rest in eternal peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. We'll take one last hand, Mr. Roberts, over there. Yeah. Thank you very much. In the interest of time, this will be our last input. Thank you.
Thank you, CEO, for the opportunity. My name is Rudy Roberts. I'd like to share a few reflections, some personal reflections, my interaction with Reverend Jesse Jackson. But before, can I just say something? I think one of the themes that we've taken away here that Dr. Pandor started off is that I think we need to, it's a project, CEO, that we need to cultivate or resuscitate, re-look at the international struggle that we've had, because the reservoir, speaking specifically of the United States, where I spent a great deal of my formative life, formative education and life, was significant, that reservoir of goodwill, interaction, and political support. It's a very important conversation to revisit and to advance for our future. I think it's dynamic for the future. But coming back to Reverend Jesse Jackson, When Reverend Jesse Jackson passed on, I was scouring the newspapers, social media to find out where would a memorial service be held for such an iconic human being. Such an iconic human being. It was very sad that I couldn't find anything, Ms. Brown, until I realized there was something with the Nelson Mandela Foundation when a friend had sent me by chance, and I asked the CEO if I could attend. In the reflections in my young life, just a week before Jesse Jackson came to South Africa, at that young, in 79, I'd left South Africa. I had to leave South Africa. And by happenstance in my college life, as I was going to visit a friend for Thanksgiving in my junior year in Chicago, his father worked as a special assistant to Mayor Harold Washington, and another fascinating and iconic African-American citizen, dynamic man. When I visited Harold Washington's office, it so happened that he was on the phone with Jesse Jackson. I'm sitting there as a little boy, precocious, 19, 18-year-old. And he says, I've got a young South African here, you must come to your church. And we went to his church that weekend. Suffice to say, when I left there, Jesse Jackson, Reverend Jackson, had given somebody to give me a $150 check. Said, take this to the young South African, he must take care of himself. As time goes by, in the second election, as time goes by, a friend of mine works for Reverend Jesse Jackson, a very close friend of mine and Dr. Pandor's brother. A significant relationship develops with them, and I have access to this conversation. And that NAACP, in 1988, the summer of 1998, Reverend Jackson gives a speech in Washington to the NAACP at the Ritz. You might remember this. And I'm invited to that. And this is a very powerful speech because it relates, his conversation is always interspersing South Africa. Whether he's in church, whether he's walking the streets, whether he's in Wall Street, he had these conferences at Wall Street, bringing the people to Wall Street, and vice versa. His exchange was phenomenal. He had a way of cultivating and creating that tapestry that very few people could do. At this speech, he says, well, the American newspapers and broadcasters had said, is Jesse Jackson qualified? Now, as black people, you know, when people say that, what they're talking about. Is he qualified? And there was a very big conversation. He gives his speech, he says, I am running for president to vindicate the children of Medgar Evers. I'm running for president to vindicate the children of Emmett Till. I'm running for president to vindicate the children of Dr. Martin Luther King. And so he goes on. And as this crescendo builds up, everybody in the audience rises to their feet. He says, and I'm running for president to vindicate the children of Nelson Mandela. And he says, I'm qualified. I'm qualified. Deep in that conversation was prescience. We were free. He met Mr. Mandela. And there are many other conversations I can tell you. In sitting with my friend, he had many anecdotes and many, just not stories, but truth about Reverend Jackson. And I witnessed the tirelessness of Reverend Jackson's ability to work 24 hours. I've seen it with my two eyes. It was remarkable how he could work 24 hours. My last anecdote, I run across, well, I meet Reverend Jackson at a conference, France-Montana conference in Morocco. And he's invited by the king of Morocco. He's invited with his entourage. He sends an assistant to say, bring the young South African man is coming with me. That's the Reverend Jackson. What is fascinating about him is that interaction, that global interaction and understanding justice, freedom, and peace at every level of his life. And for us to have this memorial service, I must thank the CEO and Dr. Naledi Pandor, chairperson of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. I see you smiling at me, DG. You remember we smuggled you to Cuba from Washington. You know that, right? There's a secret there. So I believe that Reverend Jesse Jackson, CE, Ms. Brown, will be a pillar in the pantheon of freedom and justice, where Dr. Martin Luther King is, Nelson Mandela, the great Oliver Tambo, Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi, Nkrumah, and Sojourner Truth. Thank you.
Say a million for the second.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really just am standing to celebrate that we've got such bright and brilliant and forward-looking young people. And there isn't anything for some of us to say except to say thank you for your readiness to be who you are. I want to also say that when I was their age, we were trying to fight against a mindset that says, I am nobody. And that's what we were doing in the Black Consciousness Movement. And what Jesse Jackson said in those days resonated with us. I am somebody. That's exactly what he said. And this I am somebody became something that, you know what? They are saying the same thing we are saying. And I just want to say, please, keep up the message, I am somebody. But also, the last message that is leaving us with is, keep hope alive. And if you take those two together, I am somebody, but keep hope alive, it means I am somebody to make something about that hope. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Reverend Pumlwane. Let me end off with another reflection offered by Armstrong Williams in a Sunday Independent tribute to Reverend Jackson. Said about Reverend Jackson, for more than 5 decades, Jackson stood at the intersection of protest and power, unapologetic in his focus on race, relentless in his pursuit of equity, and unafraid to confront America's deepest contradictions. The era that shaped him defined him. Jackson came of age in the segregated South, forged in the crucible of the civil rights movement under the moral thunder of Martin Luther King Jr. That generation did not believe in incremental whispers. It believed in confrontation. Jackson carried that urgency into every arena he entered. He was not crafted in a time of comfort. He was born into a time of fire. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. We would like to invite you to write a message in our book of condolences, which will be conveyed to the Jackson family. We would like to also express our deepest condolences to the Jackson family from all of us at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Of course, I think I speak for all of us in this room and on the live stream if I say we express those condolences from all of us. And lastly, we would like to also invite you to join us for a little snack and a little drink downstairs to continue the conversation and the reflection on Reverend Jackson. Thank you very much and enjoy your evening. Okay.
That was a good presentation, my brother.
Thank you, bro.
Did I tell you you deserve to be an MC? 100%.
Thanks, bro.
The camera will sound. Yeah, we're big as the ring.
Oh, I'm trained in this stuff. I trained as an actor.
Oh, that's where the English comes down.